The brochures called the Bahamas a tropical paradise. Clear waters, white sand beaches, and endless sun. Grace, Marco, and Lena had been saving for their trip for months, dreaming of the perfect vacation to escape the gray monotony of city life. When they finally landed on the island, everything seemed as magical as they'd imagined. They had chosen a less touristy island on purpose, one where the beaches were supposed to be untouched and the locals friendly. The ferry had dropped them off that afternoon, with the promise of pristine sands and calm waters just a short walk from the quaint village. But the brochure hadn't mentioned the eerie silence. It wasn't just the kind of peace you expect from a remote beach, it was too quiet. No birds sang. No waves crashed. Even the rustling of palm leaves in the breeze seemed muted. The group chalked it up to island charm at first, convincing themselves that this was the perfect quiet city dwellers only dreamed about. Their rented bungalow was a small but comfortable cabin tucked just beyond a stretch of trees. That first night, after a barbecue on the beach and a round of rum cocktails, Marco suggested they explore more of the island the next day. Grace hesitated. It's weird how empty it feels here though, right? Like where are all the other people? Even the shopkeepers barely said anything when we arrived. They're probably just laid back, Marco said, brushing it off. That's how it's supposed to be in paradise, right? No stress, no rush. But Lena wasn't convinced. Maybe. It's just, I don't know, it feels off. Did you see how everyone at the dock avoided eye contact? Like they were afraid of something. Afraid of what? Marco teased. Grace's terrible sunscreen game? Everyone laughed and the mood lightened. By midnight, they were all asleep, dreaming of clear waters and adventure. The next day, they decided to hike a trail leading to a cliffside view of the ocean. A small wooden signpost marked the entrance, Bliss Point Trail. Halfway up the path, Grace stopped suddenly. Do you guys smell that? Marco sniffed the air. It was faint but distinct, a sickly sweet odor that didn't belong in the tropical setting. Like rotting fruit but heavier. Probably a dead animal or something, Marco said, though his tone was less confident now. The three exchanged uneasy glances but continued on. At the top of the trail the view was breathtaking. The ocean stretched endlessly, its surface like liquid glass reflecting the sun. But that oppressive silence lingered, and now it felt heavier, pressing against their ears like cotton. Lena's phone buzzed, breaking the tension. She glanced at the screen and frowned. No service, but I just got a notification? What does it say? Grace asked, leaning over. Lena read it aloud, her voice shaking slightly. Do not stay past sundown. The group laughed nervously, assuming it was some weird glitch or a prank. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the air seemed to grow colder, and the trail back down felt steeper than before. By the time they reached the bungalow, the sky was painted in shades of red and orange, casting long shadows across the beach. Grace turned to look at the ocean. There's someone standing in the water, she whispered. Marco squinted. Sure enough, a figure stood knee-deep in the surf, facing away from them. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the growing wind that swept across the beach. Maybe they're fishing, Lena offered weakly. With no gear? Marco muttered. The figure stepped forward, into the water, not out of it, and disappeared beneath the surface. The wind picked up as night fell, howling through the trees around their bungalow. They tried to settle in, convincing themselves it was just their imaginations running wild, but sleep didn't come easily. At some point in the night, Marco woke to the sound of soft tapping. He froze, listening. It wasn't coming from the front door or the windows. It sounded like it was coming from inside the house. He nudged Grace awake. Do you hear that? The tapping grew louder, like wet feet slapping against the wooden floor. Grace's eyes widened. Lena? Marco called, his voice shaking. No response. They crept to Lena's room, but the bed was empty, the sheets tossed aside. The window was open, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. Then they heard it, a low, gurgling sound almost like laughter coming from the beach. Grabbing a flashlight, they ran outside, the beam cutting through the thick darkness. The beach was empty except for footprints in the sand leading toward the water. Lena? Grace called, her voice cracking. A splash came from the shoreline. When they turned the flashlight toward the ocean, they saw her. She stood knee-deep in the water, facing away from them, just like the figure they'd seen earlier. "Lena!" Marco yelled, starting toward her. Grace grabbed his arm. "Wait, something's wrong?" As if on cue, Lena turned. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Behind her, dozens of other figures began to rise from the water, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Grace screamed, pulling Marco back toward the bungalow. The figures didn't chase them, but their presence felt suffocating, the silence more deafening than ever. Barricading themselves inside the bungalow, Marco and Grace tried to call for help, but the phones were dead, and the Wi-Fi was non-existent. All they could do was wait, the sound of footsteps circling the house growing louder as the night stretched on. By morning, the footprints on the beach were gone. The ocean was calm, and Lena was nowhere to be found. The ferry arrived later that day to take them back to the main island. They didn't tell the captain what had happened. They didn't need to. "You should have listened to the warnings," he said, his voice quiet but stern. "People disappear on that island for a reason. The locals don't speak of it, but we know. The shore is cursed. The ocean takes what it wants." Marco and Grace didn't respond. They stared at the water as the ferry pulled away, half expecting to see Lena's face beneath the waves. They never returned to the Bahamas. Years later, Marco received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of a beach. In the background, partially obscured by the waves, he thought he saw Lena, smiling faintly. And on the back, written in shaky handwriting, were 3 words: "Do not return."